Well, Megan, I wonder if for now that is the one little piece of comfort for Christine Lagarde tomorrow in that ECB news conference. It might change, but for now, we're holding in there on the periphery, Megan.
Yeah, I think that's right, though I think the jury's still kind of out on this EU recovery fund, which was the reason that anyone really had faith in the Eurozone or the EU right now. And the recovery fund is kind of stuck in the plumbing. There are governance issues, but also a bunch of countries have come out and said that they don't really want to take on the loan portion of it. They just like the grants, which effectively reduces the size of the recovery fund. And as we see a resurgence of new cases across Europe, the ECB is due to meet. I don't think they'll do anything at this meeting. I think they'll just set up for further easing in December when they come out with new forecasts and when they have a better sense of how bad the second wave in Europe is. So I think Christine Lagarde will just stand pat for now, but we'll have a bearish tone so that the ECB can go ahead and ease further in December.
Megan, I want you to link pandemic news into the observation John has been making all morning on the banks, not only beleaguered EU banks, but even the U.S. banks really underperforming. And as a general statement, is the system unraveling now with this pandemic news, or can there be a bid found out there?
Well, I think that the resurgence of the virus shouldn't have surprised any of us, but I think it is surprising a lot of investors, particularly as we're seeing some countries lock down again. I think it's generally consensus that no one has any appetite for further lockdowns after what we experienced in March, April. And actually, we're seeing Ireland, Wales, for example, who locked down pretty severely, and now France and Germany are talking about measures. And so insofar as banks are a cyclical stock, I think there is this new realization that actually things could get quite bad this winter. We might have to take fairly extreme measures, though I think governments will go out of their way to make lockdowns regionalized rather than broad brush as we did before.
Where is the dialogue, and you're very good on this at Kennedy School, of getting from a 2% of GDP fiscal assistance out to what we're hearing in selective interviews, which is a need for a 5 or a 6 or a 7% of GDP fiscal package? Are we nudging towards that shock amount?
Look, a lot of the support measures in the U.S. expired already at the end of July and August. And so the longer we wait on re-upping the stimulus, the bigger it's going to have to be, particularly as we go into winter, where we're going to see a further headwind to growth. So I think that the longer we wait, the bigger that package will need to be in order to carry businesses and workers across to the other side when the weather gets warmer or when we get a vaccine or treatment. So I do think that envelope is increasing every day.
You know, it's interesting as we talk about delays in the fiscal policy, people turn to the Fed and say, what more can you do for us? Bill Dudley, former New York Fed president, came out today in a Bloomberg opinion columnist and said, probably not that much, that they probably have stimulated all that they can. Do you agree with that assessment here, this idea that the Fed has offered pretty much all that it can to stave off what could potentially be escalating bankruptcies and consumer insolvencies as the virus continues to spread?
So I don't actually agree with that. The Fed would have to get innovative and would have to do some really unconventional stuff. But there is one tool that I've been banging on about here and elsewhere, which is dual interest rates. The ECB has established them. The Bank of Israel just introduced them, whereby you have one interest rate for borrowers and a different interest rate for savers. So you can cut the borrowing rate really deeply negative and subsidize banks to lend. And then you can increase the deposit rate so that you can benefit savers. So you can subsidize borrowers and savers at the same time. That's an unambiguous stimulus across the entire economy. Now, central banks are reticent to implement this in part because it's sort of fiscal policy. And I don't think it's the best scenario. It wouldn't be my first case solution, but given that fiscal authorities aren't doing their jobs and stepping in with fiscal support, I think it's the second best solution. And this is something that the Fed can do. They're just not there yet.
Just want to bring you some headlines coming out of Boeing. The workforce at the end of 2019 was 160,000. What they're looking for by the end of 2021 is 130,000. Boeing looking at the reduction of about 7,000 additional employees. Where we started the year, Tom, and where they're looking to end 2021 is a real mark on that workforce over at their company.
Yeah, it is, John. And, and then you can fold this into our discussion with Megan Greene. It is a 25% employment reduction since the peak of 6, 7, 8 years ago. And the 20-year chart of Boeing basically is the give up of the boom. Megan Greene, is that what we're doing? I mean, I understand airlines is the heart of the pandemic, but are we framing out a giving up of the boom?
Well, I think Boeing is a special case. It was already in trouble before this pandemic hit with the 737 MAX. And Boeing has an outsized impact on the economy because it's the country's biggest manufacturing employer. So it is significant. But I don't think we can take those numbers and stretch them out across the economy. What we do know is that we've had this precipitous decline, and we saw the implications for the labor market. And then we had this massive boom. We saw the implications of those for the labor market, too. And now we're just stuck in the long, hard slog period where we've seen, many more jobs become permanent losses rather than temporary losses. The number of long-term unemployed is set to roughly triple over the next 2 months. So it's going to be harder and harder to get these workers back into the workforce. And so I think there will be scarring from that.
Megan, that was the least constructive view, and now I'd say arguably it's not anymore. Things have changed in the last month. The risk now is the second wave turns into a second dip. Megan, how do you read that at the moment, looking at the caseloads, the case increase in Europe and particularly the United States as well, and how you think this economy, consumers, companies will respond to it?
Yeah, so this is driven entirely by the virus, and I think it will be driven more by confidence than government policy. So if people feel like going out will land them up in the hospital, they're just not going to do it, whether government officials tell them that they can or not. And so as new cases spike, which we're seeing, and we're also seeing, deaths increase, I think people will become afraid, and that will be a huge headwind on the economy at a time when we're still waiting for fiscal stimulus measures in the U.S. I mean, this is sort of a perfect storm for another dip. And so that's certainly possible, but it depends entirely on the virus and also on our policymakers' ability to step in and bridge the gap.
What happens after the virus? Do you perceive a jump condition where level up back to where we were? Do you have a percentage of back to where we were? What happens when this is over?
So I think the economy will look fundamentally different after this is over. Certain industries are just never coming back. Certain companies are never coming back. And that kind of dislocation takes a while to work its way through the economy, especially as workers have to retool and reskill for new jobs. And so, after the virus, if we have a vaccine or a treatment, I think that, we still will be below where we were before this crisis hit. I think potential growth is going to be fundamentally lower. And the only thing that can change that is if we have a new stimulus package with tons of innovation and infrastructure spending and things that fundamentally boost potential growth.